Danny and my buddy Mikey have been working at Pete's Pizzeria for years. It's just your regular joint cranking out slices and dealing with the usual scumbags that wander in. But there's one guy who's made our lives a living hell, this massive skinhead who's been bullying us since high school. Man, I can't stand that Chad guy Mikey would mutter under his breath whenever the bell on the door jingled and that bald head came strolling in. Guy thinks he runs this place? Yeah, no kidding, I'd agree, trying to avoid eye contact as Chad swagger up to the counter. Just ignore him. Maybe he'll go away, but Chad never went away. He'd stand there, glaring at us with those beady little eyes, demanding extra cheese or some other small nitpick, then sneer as he snatched the slice out of our hands. There was nothing we could do. The guy was built like a freight train, and we both knew he'd flatten us if we tried anything. The worst was when Chad would come in with his dirtbag buddies, laughing and shoving each other around, knocking over displays and generally making a mess of the place. Mikey and I would watch helplessly from behind the counter, gripping the edge until our knuckles turned white. "Don't even think about saying anything," Chad would growl, catching me glaring. "You little shits better keep your mouths shut, unless you want me to shut them for you," the other guys would snicker, puffing out their chests like a bunch of gorillas. I'd grit my teeth and force a smile, not daring to argue. There was no point. We both knew Chad could flatten us without breaking a sweat. "Just let it go," man, Mikey would mutter after they finally cleared out. "Not worth the trouble." I knew he was right, but it still boiled my blood watching that punk swagger around like he owned the place. If only there was some way to get him back, to show him he couldn't push us around. A few weeks later, Mikey came in looking like absolute hell. His eyes were red and watery, his nose was a leaky faucet, and he was sniffling and coughing up a storm. "Dude, you look terrible," I said as he trudged behind the counter. "You catch some kind of bug?" "Nah, man. Just this killer sinus infection," Mikey groaned, blowing his nose loudly into a napkin. "I feel like my head's gonna explode." "This thing is kicking my ass," I winced sympathetically. Sinus infections were the worst. I remembered how much they'd used to mess me up back in the day. But then an idea started forming in my mind, a devious little plan. "Hey, you think you could," I lowered my voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Really let it rip the next time that Chad guy comes in." Mikey's eyes went wide. "You mean like on his food?" I nodded slowly, a grin spreading across my face. Just imagine the look on that punk's face when he realizes what he's been eating. Mikey hesitated for a moment, then a mischievous smile crept across his own face. "Dude, I think I can manage that." As we were getting the restaurant ready to open the next day, Mikey and I huddled together behind the counter, whispering excitedly about our plan. "All right, so here's what we're gonna do," I said, leaning in close. "When Chad orders something, like maybe a breadstick or something, I'll accidentally drop it on the floor a few times. Then you can just let loose with that infected nose of yours all over it." Mikey snickered. "Oh man, that's sick. I love it." "And then we'll just smother it in cheese and butter to really cover up the special seasoning," I continued, trying to hold back a laugh. "This is going to be epic," Mikey said, rubbing his hands together. "I can't wait to see the look on that jerk's face." We fist bumped, grinning from ear to ear. Sure, it was a little gross, but after all the crap Chad had put us through, he totally had it coming. This was going to be the best revenge ever. The opportunity presented itself sooner than we expected. Right around lunchtime, the familiar jingle of the door announced Chad's arrival. Mikey and I exchanged a quick, conspiratorial glance as he swaggered up to the counter. "All right, gimme a breadstick or something," Chad barked, slapping a handful of change on the counter. "You got it," I said, trying to keep my voice casual as I grabbed a breadstick and deliberately let it slip from my fingers. It hit the floor with a thud, rolling under the counter. "Oops, my bad," I said, bending down to retrieve it. As I picked it up, I made sure to give it a good rub on the bottom of my shoe for good measure. "Hurry it up," "Well, yeah," Chad snapped, tapping his foot impatiently. I reemerged from behind the counter, breadstick in hand, and passed it to Mikey. He immediately brought it up to his face, letting out a series of violent, phlegm-filled sneezes all over it. "Sorry, dude," Mikey said, grinning wickedly as he coated the bread in a thick layer of mucus. "Nasty sinus infection, you know." "Whatever. Just give it to me," Chad grumbled, snatching the breadstick out of Mikey's hand. He quickly drowned it in butter and cheese, completely oblivious to what we'd done. Mikey and I watched with barely contained glee as Chad took a big bite, chewing contentedly. If only he knew. Chad devoured the breadstick in just a few ravenous bites, completely unaware of the horrors that lay within. Mikey and I exchanged gleeful glances, stifling our laughter as we watched him lick the grease and crumbs from his fingers. Not bad, Chad mumbled through a full mouth, reaching into his pocket for a few coins. Keep the change. He tossed the measly tip onto the counter and turned to leave, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Mikey and I waited with bated breath, almost giddy with anticipation. Any second now, the realization was going to hit him. He was going to feel the thick, gooey mucus sliding down his throat, taste the salty sweat and dirt from the floor. And then the horror would dawn on his face, and Mikey and I would finally get the satisfaction we'd been craving. But Chad just continued on his way, utterly oblivious to the nasty surprise he'd just consumed. He didn't even break stride as he pushed open the door and disappeared back out onto the street. I looked at Mikey, bewildered. Did he not notice? Mikey shrugged, equally stunned. Guess the guy's got a cast iron stomach or something. We stood there in silence for a moment, our triumphant smiles slowly fading. So much for our big revenge plan. But as the initial disappointment wore off, a new feeling started to take its place, a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that we'd pulled one over on that jerk, even if he didn't realize it. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Mikey and I kept glancing at each other, grinning like idiots every time we thought about what we'd done. It was almost as if we could still see Chad's unsuspecting face as he savored that disgusting breadstick, blissfully unaware of the nasty surprise he'd just consumed. Can you believe that guy? Mikey chuckled as we were closing up shop. He just wolfed it down like it was nothing. I know, right? I shook my head in disbelief. I was sure he was going to freak out or something, but nope, he just kept on trucking. We both laughed, relishing the memory. Sure, it didn't have the dramatic payoff we'd been hoping for, but in a way that almost made it better. The fact that Chad had been completely oblivious to our little prank, that he'd just carried on with his day none the wiser, it was almost more satisfying than if he'd reacted the way we'd expected. As I swept up the last of the crumbs and locked the door, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. We may not have gotten the big, dramatic confrontation we'd dreamed of, but we'd still managed to get a little bit of revenge on that bully. And knowing that he'd unknowingly ingested all that nasty stuff, well, that was just the icing on the cake. Hey, you think we should do it again sometime? Mikey asked mischievously as we headed to our cars. I paused for a moment, then grinned. You know, I just might take you up on that. As the days passed, Mikey and I found ourselves grinning and chuckling to each other every time Chad came strolling through the door. We'd exchange knowing looks, relishing the memory of our little prank and the fact that the oblivious jerk had no idea what we'd done. Did you see the way he scarfed that down? I'd whisper to Mikey, elbowing him playfully. Guy's got an iron stomach, I'll give him that. Mikey would snicker in response, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe he just kept on eating like nothing happened. That was priceless. We'd both break out into fits of quiet laughter, reveling in our little victory. Sure, it wasn't the grand, dramatic showdown we'd fantasized about, but in a way that made it all the sweeter. The fact that Chad had been completely clueless, that he'd unknowingly ingested our nasty little concoction without even batting an eye, it was almost better than if he'd reacted the way we'd hoped. Whenever Chad would leave, tossing his measly tip on the counter, Mikey and I would high-five and congratulate each other. We felt like a couple of mischievous school kids who had just pulled off the ultimate prank. And in a way, I guess that's exactly what we were. Man, we really showed that jerk, didn't we? Mikey would say, his eyes gleaming with triumph. You bet we did, I'd reply, grinning from ear to ear. And the best part is, he'll never even know.